My name is Evelyn Brooks. I'm 52 years old. For most of my life, I believed that being a good mother meant staying quiet, being patient, letting things pass. I believed love meant endurance, that if I stayed calm long enough, kind enough, forgiving enough, everything would eventually fix itself. That belief carried me through years of sacrifice. It also nearly destroyed me. Because one ordinary evening proved something I had never wanted to admit. Love, when mixed with control, can turn dangerous. It didn't begin with shouting. It didn't begin with anger. It began with something so small it still sounds unreal when I say it out loud. A bowl of soup. The soup was still warm when I placed it on the table in front of my son, Callum. I remember the steam rising gently, curling into the air like nothing in the world was wrong, like this was just another family dinner. My hands trembled slightly, but I kept my voice soft. "Careful," I said. "It's hot." Callum didn't look at me. He sat hunched over his phone, shoulders tight, jaw clenched. The same jaw I once kissed when he scraped it learning how to ride a bike. Back then, he cried over small things. Now, he frightened me. I stood there a moment longer than necessary, hoping for something, a thank you, a nod, any sign that I still mattered in my own home. He lifted the spoon and tasted the soup once, then again. Slowly, his face changed. Not anger at first, disappointment, the dangerous kind. "There's no salt," he said. His voice was calm, but my stomach tightened instantly. "Oh, I must have forgotten," I replied quickly. "I'll add some." I reached for the salt shaker. I never reached it. Callum stood up so suddenly his chair scraped violently against the floor. "How hard is it to cook properly?" he snapped. The room froze. My daughter-in-law, Laura, stopped mid-movement. My granddaughter, Amelia, lowered her spoon, eyes wide, lips trembling. "I'm sorry," I said. "I'll fix it right now." That's when his hand came from nowhere. The sound reached my ears before the pain did. A sharp crack. My head snapped to the side and the world spun violently. I stumbled back into the counter before sliding down onto the cold kitchen floor. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My cheek burned, my ears rang, and the only thought in my head was this: did my own son just hit me? Callum stood over me, chest rising and falling, eyes dark with something I didn't recognize. "All I asked for was proper food," he said. "Is that too much?" Laura gasped softly. Amelia screamed. I looked up at him from the floor, my vision blurred, my heart pounding. This was the boy I carried for 9 months, the boy I stayed awake for when he had nightmares, the boy I protected from his father's temper. And now, this. He grabbed his jacket and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. Silence followed, heavy, crushing. I stayed on the floor longer than I should have. The soup cooled, my cheeks swelled. Laura helped me up without meeting my eyes. Amelia wrapped her arms tightly around my legs, shaking. "Nana, are you okay?" she whispered. I wanted to lie, but I didn't. I will be, I promise. That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment again and again. The sound, the look in his eyes, the way he didn't even hesitate. And then the realization settled in, slow, terrifying, undeniable. This wasn't the first time Callum had treated me like this. It was just the first time he used his hand. And somewhere in the darkness, with my face still throbbing and my heart breaking, I made a decision that would change everything. I would not scream. I would not beg. I would pay attention. Because what my son didn't realize that night was that the quiet version of me was gone. After that night, the house no longer felt like a place I lived in. It felt like a place I was being watched. Nothing had physically changed. The furniture stood where it always had. The walls carried the same pictures. But the air had shifted. It was heavier, thicker, as if every room was holding its breath. Callum came back late that night. I heard the front door open carefully, quietly, like he didn't want attention or witnesses. I stayed in my bedroom, lying perfectly still, listening to his footsteps move down the hallway I had cleaned and painted myself years ago. He didn't knock. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't say a word. The next morning, he behaved as if nothing had happened. That was what frightened me most. He sat at the kitchen table, scrolling on his phone, drinking the coffee I had made out of habit. Laura moved carefully around him, as if any sudden sound might break something. Amelia barely touched her breakfast. No one mentioned my face. The bruise had darkened overnight, spreading beneath my skin like ink in water. Callum never once looked at it, not even by accident. It was as if ignoring it made it disappear. That's when I understood something clearly. The slap hadn't been a loss of control. It had been a message. And the message was simple. I can hurt you, and you'll stay quiet. Days passed, and his behavior changed, but not the way people imagine after violence. He didn't shout. He didn't explode again. He corrected me. If I spoke too much, he sighed. If I asked a question, he smirked. If I disagreed, he tilted his head and smiled slowly, like he was indulging a child. "You're overthinking again, Mom. You're always so sensitive. You remember things wrong sometimes." Gaslighting doesn't bruise your skin. It bruises your sense of reality. I started questioning myself. Maybe it wasn't that hard. Maybe I startled him. Maybe I really am too emotional. That doubt became his strongest weapon. Soon, new rules appeared, quietly, casually. He wanted to know where I was going, who I spoke to on the phone, why I needed money. One evening, while I was looking for my bank card, he said lightly, "You don't really need to manage finances anymore. I'll take care of it." I laughed nervously, but he didn't laugh back. He just stared at me until my smile fell from my face. A few days later, I found an envelope on the dining room table. Inside were printed documents, property papers, my name typed neatly at the top, and underneath it, his. My hand shook as I flipped through the pages. When I asked him about it, he didn't deny anything. "It's just planning," he said calmly. "You're not getting any younger." In that moment, everything clicked. The slap wasn't about soup. It was about control. Laura began avoiding me completely. When I tried to speak to her, she glanced at Callum first, like she needed permission. Amelia stopped hugging me when he was around. That hurt more than the slap ever did. One night, I heard raised voices coming from their bedroom. Not shouting, something colder, controlled. Anger. I heard Laura say, "Please stop." Without thinking, I opened my phone and pressed record. I didn't know why yet. I just knew I needed proof. From that day on, I started watching everything, every sentence, every look, every threat disguised as concern. Callum began saying things like, "If you ever told anyone, they wouldn't believe you. People talk about women your age, Mom. You don't want them thinking you're confused." That's when fear settled deep into my bones. Not loud fear, quiet fear. The kind that whispers at breakfast, "You're trapped." But alongside that fear, something else was growing. Awareness. I noticed how polite he was around neighbors, how charming he became in public, how reasonable he sounded when others were listening. No one would ever believe what happened behind closed doors unless I was ready. One afternoon, while Callum was out, Laura sat across from me at the kitchen table. Her hands were shaking. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I should have stopped him." I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I asked her one simple question. "Has he ever scared you?" She didn't reply. She didn't need to. That silence told me everything. After that, the house felt smaller. I learned to walk softly, to speak carefully, to disappear without leaving. Callum noticed. The quieter I became, the more powerful he felt. He began alternating kindness with coldness. Groceries one day, silence the next. Confusion followed. That confusion was intentional. One evening, he leaned against the doorway and said casually, "You know, Laura and I have been talking." My hands froze in the sink. "About what?" I asked. "About space," he replied. "This house feels crowded." Crowded in my own home. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a discussion. It was a warning. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was afraid, but because I finally saw the shape of his plan. He wasn't just trying to silence me, he was trying to remove me. And every time he underestimated me, every time he assumed fear had broken me, he was giving me exactly what I needed. Distance to see him clearly, without the fog of guilt and habit. Distance to understand that what I was living in wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a system designed to make me smaller, quieter, easier to move. I stopped trying to fix things. That alone changed everything. When I no longer rushed to smooth over his moods, Callum grew restless. He lingered in doorways longer. He watched me more closely, as if waiting for me to slip back into the old version of myself. I didn't. I kept my answers short, neutral, unemotional. Yes, no, I don't know. It unsettled him. One evening, he deliberately criticized the way I folded the laundry, not loudly, never loudly anymore, but with a careful, cutting tone. "You've always done it wrong," he said, picking up a shirt and refolding it slowly, deliberately, as if teaching a child. I watched him quietly. When he didn't respond, he looked up, annoyed. "Aren't you going to say anything?" I met his eyes and replied calmly, "If you prefer it another way, you can do it." The silence that followed felt electric. That was new. I had broken a rule without raising my voice. From that day on, his patience shortened. He began creating situations, small tests meant to provoke me. He'd move my things and wait for me to notice. He'd cancel plans without telling me. He'd make jokes at my expense in front of Laura and Amelia, watching closely to see if I'd laugh along. I didn't. Laura noticed. One afternoon, while Amelia was at school and Callum was out, Laura whispered, "You're different lately." I looked at her. "Am I?" She nodded. "He doesn't like it." That confirmation steadied me. It told me I was doing something right. The next escalation came disguised as concern. Callum suggested I see a doctor. "You've been tired," he said lightly, "forgetful. It's probably nothing, but better to check." He said it in front of Laura, in front of Amelia. The message was clear. I decide what's normal about you. I agreed. That surprised him. "Sure," I said. "Let's book it." He blinked, thrown off by my calm. Later that night, I realized why agreeing mattered. It took away his leverage. It meant he couldn't accuse me of avoiding help. It meant the story he was building would have to be better than the truth. Truth, I was learning, is dangerous to people like him. A few days later, something else shifted. Mail began arriving in Callum's name, official-looking envelopes he opened quickly and put away. When I entered the room, conversation stopped. When I asked simple questions, answers came too fast, too rehearsed. I started noticing dates, noticing timing. He often left the house just before important phone calls. He scheduled things during hours he knew I'd be alone. He preferred privacy not because he feared being overheard, but because he feared being contradicted. One night, as I cleared the table, he said casually, "If anything ever happens to you, I'll take care of everything." It sounded kind. It wasn't. It was ownership disguised as loyalty. I smiled politely and said nothing. Inside, my heart hammered, because I understood now that this wasn't about anger. It was about entitlement. He believed my life, my home, my choices, my voice belonged to him. And entitlement doesn't negotiate. It removes obstacles. I began preparing in ways no one noticed. I memorized important phone numbers. I wrote dates and details on scraps of paper and hid them in places only I would look. I tested how long I could leave the house without explanation. Each small act was a quiet declaration. I still exist. Callum sensed the shift. He began hovering more, asking where I was going, how long I'd be gone, why I needed privacy. I answered honestly, but briefly, and that made him angry in a new way, not explosive, calculating. One evening, as I passed him in the hallway, he said softly, "You know, Mum, people like you don't do well alone." I stopped walking. I turned and looked at him. For the first time, I didn't see my son. I saw someone measuring risk. I said nothing and continued down the hall. That night, lying in bed, I finally admitted the truth I had been circling for weeks. This wasn't going to end on its own, and it wouldn't end gently. Something would have to break, either my silence or his control, and I knew which one I was done sacrificing. The days that followed felt stretched, like time itself had slowed down just to watch what would happen next. Callum became more observant. He started noticing things he never cared about before. What time I woke up, how long I stayed in the shower, where I went when I left the house. Each question was asked casually, but his eyes stayed on me too long, weighing my answers. "Going out again?" he asked one morning. "Yes," I replied, tying my coat. "For what?" he pressed. "Fresh air." That answer annoyed him. I could tell by the way his mouth tightened, by the pause before he spoke again. "You don't need to wander around so much. You're safer at home." Safer. The word echoed in my mind long after I stepped outside. I walked further than usual that day, letting the cold air clear my head. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to relief. No walls, no footsteps behind me, no careful measuring of my tone. But when I returned, the house greeted me with tension. Callum was waiting in the living room. "You didn't say where you were going," he said. "I don't need permission," I replied quietly. The silence that followed was heavy. Laura stood frozen near the doorway. Amelia clutched her school bag, eyes darting between us. Callum smiled slowly. "Of course you don't," he said. "I just worry about you." I nodded and walked past him, my heart pounding. That was the first time I openly pushed back, and I paid for it later. That night, he turned the heating off. It was subtle, plausibly accidental. When I mentioned the cold, he shrugged. "You're always cold," he said. "Put on another jumper." I lay awake shivering, realizing how easy it would be for him to make daily life uncomfortable without ever touching me again. Control didn't need violence anymore. It had evolved. A few days later, he moved my chair at the dining table. Just a few inches. Enough that I noticed, enough that I felt off balance sitting down. When I adjusted it back, he smirked. "Still picky about everything," he said lightly. I said nothing, but I began to understand something important. He was testing how much he could take without resistance, and every time I didn't react the way he expected, his frustration grew. One afternoon, Laura found me in the kitchen and whispered, "He's been asking about you." "About what?" I asked. About your memory, she said, whether you've been forgetting things. My stomach dropped. That was when I realized the danger had shifted. This wasn't just about removing me from the house. This was about rewriting who I was. If he could convince people I was unstable, everything else would fall into place easily. My objections would sound like confusion. My fear would look like paranoia. That thought terrified me more than anything else he'd done, because once someone takes your credibility, they can take everything. That evening, he brought it up directly. "Mom," he said, sitting across from me, "have you noticed you've been a bit distracted lately?" I met his gaze. "No," I said calmly. He tilted his head. "You forgot where you put your keys yesterday." "I found them." "You forgot what day it was." "I didn't." Laura looked between us nervously. Callum smiled. "See," he said gently, "you don't even realize it." That was the moment I stopped seeing him as my son entirely. That voice, soft, patient, concerned, was rehearsed, weaponized. I excused myself and went upstairs, locking my door behind me. My hands shook as I sat on the bed. He was accelerating. Something was coming. Over the next week, his behavior became more unpredictable. Some days he was overly attentive, offering tea, asking if I needed anything. Other days he barely acknowledged me, speaking about me in the third person even when I was in the room. "Mom doesn't like loud noise," he'd say to Amelia. "Mom gets confused easily," he'd tell Laura. Each sentence chipped away at me, but instead of breaking, something inside me hardened. I started paying attention not just to what he said, but when he said it. He made these comments when others were present, never alone. That told me everything. He wasn't losing control. He was staging it. Late one night, I heard him pacing downstairs. I stood at the top of the stairs, listening. "I just need more time," he said quietly into his phone. "No, she doesn't suspect anything." My heart pounded so hard I thought he might hear it. That was confirmation. Whatever he was planning, it was deliberate, and it was close. I went back to my room, locked the door, and sat on the bed until dawn. By morning, fear had turned into something else entirely: resolve. Because I finally understood the truth. If I waited for things to get better, they wouldn't. They would only get worse. And if I didn't act soon, I wouldn't get another chance. Callum believed he was wearing me down. He believed confusion would make me compliant. But what he didn't realize was this: every small cruelty, every calculated comment, every quiet threat was sharpening my focus. He thought he was preparing the ground to remove me. In reality, he was preparing me to fight back. By the time I admitted I needed to act, I already knew one thing for certain: I couldn't rush. Callum thrived on reaction. He expected panic, confrontation, mistakes. So I gave him none of that. Instead, I became careful. Careful about where I spoke, careful about what I showed, careful about how much of myself I let him see. On the surface, I slipped back into the version of me he preferred: quiet, compliant, unremarkable. I thanked him when he brought groceries. I nodded when he corrected me. I asked fewer questions. He relaxed. And that was exactly what I needed, because relaxed people make mistakes. My first step was information, not confrontation, not accusations, facts. I started small. At the local library, I used a computer he didn't know I had access to. I created a new email address, one he'd never see. I sent copies of everything I could remember to find: old bank statements, utility bills, council tax letters, my marriage certificate. Each document felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. I learned how to check property records online. It took me an entire afternoon, my hands shaking as I clicked through unfamiliar pages. The house was still legally mine. That alone steadied me, but I didn't trust it to stay that way. Next, I turned my attention to proof. I already had recordings, snippets of his voice, his tone, the way he spoke when he thought no one would challenge him. But I needed more than anger. I needed a pattern. So I began recording selectively, not everything, only moments that mattered. Comments about my confusion, suggestions that I couldn't manage money, statements about what's best for everyone. I kept my phone hidden in my pocket, my heart pounding each time I pressed record. I learned how to keep my breathing steady so the microphone wouldn't catch it. Laura noticed. One evening, while Callum was out, she stood beside me at the sink and whispered, "What are you doing?" I didn't answer right away. Then I said, "Protecting myself." She swallowed hard. That was the moment she stopped avoiding my eyes. Over the following days, Laura began helping in small, quiet ways. She told me when Callum had meetings, when he'd be late, when his mood was dark. She never said his name when she warned me. She didn't have to. I also began documenting timelines, dates when documents went missing, dates when the locks were changed, dates when he told others I was forgetful. Writing it down transformed fear into clarity. This wasn't chaos, it was escalation, and escalation follows logic. One afternoon, while Callum was out, I found something that made my stomach drop, a folder in the spare room. Inside were printed notes, my name at the top of several pages, phrases like "needs supervision," "struggles with daily tasks," "easily confused." My life reduced to bullet points. That was the moment I understood how far he was willing to go. He wasn't just planning to move me out, he was preparing to erase me. I photographed everything, every page, every note. Then I put the folder back exactly where I found it. That night, I didn't sleep, not from fear, from urgency. The next step was legal advice. Not the police, not yet. Not confrontation, not ever. Advice. Through the library computer, I searched for local legal aid clinics. I found one that offered confidential consultations for older adults experiencing family coercion. The word coercion stopped me because that's what it was. Not just abuse, not just control, coercion. I booked an appointment under my new email. When the day came, I told Callum I was going to the chemist. He nodded absently, distracted. At the clinic, my voice shook as I spoke, but the woman across from me didn't interrupt. She listened. She asked precise questions. She took notes. When I showed her the recordings and the photographs, her expression changed. "This is serious, and you're right to be careful." Those words, "you're right," felt like oxygen. She explained my options: protective orders, financial safeguards, documentation strategies. But most importantly, she told me this: do nothing suddenly. People like him escalate when they feel control slipping. I already knew that. Before I left, she gave me a list of steps: clear, practical, quiet. I followed them exactly. I opened a separate bank account. I redirected important mail to a safe address. I made certified copies of essential documents. Each step was small. Together, they were power.
Back home, Callum remained unaware. He laughed more, he relaxed. He even joked one evening, saying, "See, things are better when we all stay calm." I smiled politely. Inside, I was counting days, counting evidence, counting his mistakes. Because now I wasn't just surviving him, I was preparing for the moment he would overreach. And I knew he would. People who believe they own others always do. Callum's mistake came sooner than I expected. It arrived disguised as confidence. Once he believed I was fully subdued, quiet, agreeable, no longer questioning, he stopped hiding his plans so carefully. He began talking more freely, assuming I either wouldn't understand or wouldn't dare to object.
One evening, while Laura was bathing Amelia, he sat across from me and said casually, "I've spoken to someone about the house." I kept my expression neutral. "About what?" I asked. "Future arrangements," he replied. "Just in case." In case. I nodded slowly, the way he liked. "I suppose that's sensible," I said. That answer pleased him. He leaned back, relaxed, and added something he hadn't meant to say. "It'll be easier once everything's officially sorted." Officially. I repeated the word silently in my head. That night, after everyone went to bed, I checked the spare room again. The folder was still there, but thinner. Some pages were missing. That told me two things. First, he was moving forward. Second, he believed there was nothing left for me to find. He was wrong. Over the next week, Laura changed. Not dramatically, not openly, but she became braver. She started answering my questions without looking over her shoulder. She warned me when Callum had phone calls. She told me when letters arrived and where he put them. One morning, while Callum was out, Laura handed me her phone. "You should hear this," she whispered. It was a voice message he'd sent her the night before. Calm, controlled, cold. "If she doesn't cooperate, we'll have to make decisions for her. You understand that, right?" I felt my hands tremble. Laura watched my face carefully. "He scares me," she said quietly, "and I don't want Amelia growing up thinking this is normal." That was the moment I stopped thinking of Laura as a bystander. She was a witness, and witnesses change everything. With her permission, I copied the message and saved it securely. Then I did something I hadn't planned to do yet. I told her the truth. Not all of it, but enough. I told her I was documenting everything, that I'd spoken to legal aid, that I was preparing in case things escalated. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she nodded slowly. "Tell me what you need," she said. From that day on, we worked quietly together. She noted dates and times. She kept track of conversations. She told me when Callum used certain phrases, ones he repeated when he felt entitled. We learned his patterns together, and patterns, once visible, lose their power. The final piece of evidence arrived unexpectedly. It arrived through the post, addressed to Callum, marked urgent. Laura intercepted it before he came home. Inside was an appointment notice, a private assessment. My name was listed. Under reason for referral, it read, "Concerns regarding capacity and independent living." My chest tightened. This was it. This wasn't preparation anymore. This was execution. Callum planned to present me as incapable, legally, officially, before I even knew what was happening. Laura's hands shook as she held the paper. "He didn't tell me about this," she said. I folded the notice carefully. He wasn't going to. That afternoon, I contacted the legal advisor again. Her response was immediate and serious. "This changes the timeline," she said. "You're no longer preparing, you're responding." She instructed me to gather everything: recordings, photos, messages, witness statements.
She also advised me to see my own doctor independently and document my mental and physical health, not because I doubted myself, but because I needed proof. The next few days moved quickly. I visited my GP. I explained everything calmly. I showed him the bruise photos, the messages, the recordings. He listened. Then he wrote a report. Clear, professional, unambiguous. I was capable. I was coherent. I was under distress due to family coercion. That report became my shield. At home, Callum grew impatient. He sensed something had shifted. "You've been busy lately," he said one evening, "out a lot." "Yes," I replied simply. "Doing what?" "Taking care of myself." The look on his face flickered. Annoyance, suspicion, fear. That was new. A few days later, he tried one last tactic. Kindness. He brought home flowers, suggested dinner out, even apologized, vaguely. "I didn't mean to upset you," he said. "You know how stress gets." I thanked him, and I documented it, because apologies without accountability are just manipulation in softer clothing. By now, everything was in place. The evidence, the witnesses, the professional reports. All that remained was timing, and Callum, confident in his control, was about to give me that too. Because the appointment, the one meant to strip me of my autonomy, was only days away, and this time I wouldn't walk into it alone. The days leading up to that appointment felt unreal, as if I were watching my own life from a distance. Callum became strangely calm, too calm. He stopped pressuring me, stopped correcting me, even stopped hovering. That sudden withdrawal told me everything I needed to know. He believed the outcome was already decided. People who think they've won don't argue anymore. They wait. I used that waiting period carefully. I met my legal advisor again and handed over the final pieces of evidence. She organized everything into a timeline so clear it frightened even me. Seeing my life reduced to dates, quotes, and actions stripped away every excuse I'd ever made for him. This wasn't misunderstanding. This wasn't stress. This was intent. She helped me draft a statement, calm, factual, unemotional. No accusations, no dramatic language, just truth presented plainly. "Emotion weakens credibility," she told me gently. "Facts don't." I practiced reading that statement aloud until my voice stopped shaking. Laura prepared her own notes. She wrote down the things she had seen, the things she had heard, and the moments she had been afraid to speak. Watching her do that was quietly devastating. I realized how long she, too, had been shrinking herself to survive. We didn't talk about Callum much during those days. We talked about Amelia, about school, about bedtime stories, about the kind of world we wanted her to grow up in. That kept us steady. At home, Callum behaved exactly as Callum expected. I didn't confront him. I didn't hint at what I knew. I thanked him for dinner and asked if he wanted tea. I let him believe the version of me he'd carefully constructed was real. That was the hardest part, pretending. But pretending kept me safe. The night before the appointment, Callum knocked on my bedroom door. Not hard, not softly, precisely. "You're ready for tomorrow?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. He nodded. "Good. This will help everyone." Everyone. I watched him closely, memorizing his face, the certainty in his eyes, the complete absence of doubt. He genuinely believed he was doing the right thing. That belief, I knew, would be his undoing. After he left, I sat on the edge of my bed and allowed myself one moment of fear. Just one. I thought about how easily this could have gone differently, how many people never get the chance to prepare, how many are removed quietly, efficiently, without anyone questioning the story told about them. I understood then how close I'd come to disappearing. But I hadn't, because I had listened when something felt wrong, because I had stopped explaining his behavior away, because I had chosen observation over confrontation, and because finally I'd accepted this truth. Being quiet doesn't mean being powerless. Sometimes it means gathering strength. When I lay down to sleep, I didn't know exactly how the next day would unfold, but I knew one thing with certainty. The version of events Callum had written, the one where I was confused, incapable, and easily erased, was about to be challenged. Not with anger, not with emotion, but with clarity.
The morning of the appointment arrived quietly. Too quietly. Callum woke up early, dressed carefully, and spoke in a calm voice that almost sounded kind. He made tea, asked if I'd slept well, even held the door open for me as we left the house. To anyone watching, he looked like a devoted son taking care of his aging mother, and that was exactly the image he wanted. The drive was silent, not uncomfortable, controlled. Callum hummed softly, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel. I stared out of the window, watching familiar streets pass by, wondering how many people lived inside situations just like mine, quietly, invisibly. When we arrived, he parked confidently and said, "This is just a formality." I nodded. Inside the waiting room, the smell of disinfectant and coffee, neutral colors, neutral faces, the kind of place where decisions were made quickly and lives were quietly redirected. Callum checked in at the desk. I sat down. And then something shifted. Laura walked in, holding Amelia's hand. Behind her came my legal advisor. Callum froze. Not dramatically, just enough. "What's this?" he asked, keeping his voice low. I stood up slowly. "This," I said calmly, "is me not coming alone." For the first time, his mask cracked. The evaluator called my name. We all went in together. The room was small, clinical, a table, 4 chairs, a folder already waiting in the center. The assessor smiled politely and began explaining the purpose of the appointment. Before she could continue, my advisor spoke. "We'd like to submit additional information before proceeding." Callum opened his mouth to object, but the assessor raised a hand. "Of course," she said. One by one, the documents were placed on the table. The recordings, the photographs, the written timeline, the GP's report. Callum's face drained of color as he realized what he was looking at. "This isn't necessary," he said quickly. "My mother is confused. She doesn't understand." "I understand perfectly." The room went silent. I spoke slowly, carefully, reading from my statement. Dates, words he had used, actions he had taken. No emotion, just facts. When I finished, the assessor leaned back in her chair. "Mr. Brooks," she said, "this appointment was requested under false premises." Callum laughed nervously. "You're exaggerating," he said. "She's emotional." Laura stood up. "No," she said quietly. "She's telling the truth." That was the moment everything collapsed. Callum turned to her shocked. "You're on her side?" he snapped. "I'm on our daughter's side," Laura replied. Amelia squeezed her hand. The assessor closed the folder. "There will be no further assessment today, and based on what I've seen, safeguarding procedures will be initiated." Callum stood up abruptly. "This is ridiculous," he said. "You're all overreacting." But no one was listening anymore. Security was called, not aggressively, but professionally. Callum was asked to leave. As he was escorted out, he turned to look at me. For the first time, there was fear in his eyes. Not anger, fear. Because he finally understood. He had lost control. Outside, the sunlight felt unreal. Laura hugged me tightly. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I should have acted sooner."
I acted when it mattered, replied I. That afternoon, the legal steps moved quickly. Protective measures were put in place. Access to my finances was blocked. The house was secured in my name. Callum wasn't allowed to return. When he tried to call, the calls were unanswered. When he texted, they were documented. That evening, I sat in my living room, the same room that had once felt like a cage, and realized something profound. The silence felt different. It wasn't fear, it was peace. But the climax wasn't over yet, because consequences don't end at exposure. They begin there. The days that followed moved faster than I expected. What Callum had built carefully for months began to unravel in a matter of hours.
The safeguarding report triggered a chain reaction. Phone calls, emails, quiet meetings held behind closed doors. People who had never questioned him before began asking careful, uncomfortable questions. And Callum, who had always relied on certainty, started making mistakes. He called repeatedly. At first, his messages were calm. "Mom, this has gone too far. We need to talk privately." I didn't respond. Silence, I'd learned, was no longer weakness. Then the tone shifted. "You're ruining the family. You don't know what you've done." Each message was saved, logged, forwarded. Laura moved out with Amelia that same week, not dramatically, no shouting, just packed bags and a quiet goodbye. She didn't leave a note, she didn't owe him one. When Callum found out, he came to the house. I wasn't there. He stood outside for a long time, ringing the bell, knocking, pacing. A neighbor watched from across the street and later told me he looked lost, like someone waiting for a door that would never open again. A temporary protection order arrived 2 days later. Callum was legally barred from returning. That was the first moment the reality hit him, not emotionally, practically. Control doesn't disappear all at once, it erodes, and erosion terrifies people who depend on it. Through my solicitor, I learned that Callum had tried to explain everything away: stress, miscommunication, concern for my well-being, the same words he'd used on me. They didn't work anymore, because now there were records, there were witnesses, there was consistency. Truth has weight when it's documented. One afternoon, weeks later, I agreed to a supervised conversation, not for reconciliation, but for closure. We met in a neutral room, no warmth, no familiarity. Callum sat across from me, restless, tapping his fingers the way he used to when he was impatient. "You didn't have to do this," he said finally. "You could have just talked to me." I looked at him carefully. "I tried," I said. "You didn't listen." He scoffed. "You always exaggerate." That word again. I leaned forward slightly. "Do you remember the soup?" I asked. He paused. "What?" "The night you hit me," I said calmly. "Do you remember what you said?" His jaw tightened. "I was angry." "No," I replied. "You were entitled." The word landed hard. For a moment he looked genuinely confused, as if no one had ever framed his behavior that way before. "I did everything for you," he said suddenly. "Everything." "That's the problem," I answered. "You thought that gave you ownership." Silence filled the room. This time he had nothing to say. He stood up abruptly, chair scraping back. "You think you've won? You think this makes you strong?" I didn't raise my voice. "I think it makes me free." That was the last conversation we ever had. After that, things settled into a new rhythm, a quieter one. Legal proceedings continued methodically. The house remained mine. My finances were protected. A long-term safeguarding plan was put in place. Laura filed for separation. Amelia started therapy. And slowly, day by day, the tension I had carried in my body began to loosen. I slept through the night for the first time in months. I cooked meals without fear of criticism. I laughed once, unexpectedly, and realized how long it had been since laughter had come naturally.
One afternoon, Amelia sat beside me on the sofa and said softly, "Nana, are we safe now?" I put my arm around her and answered honestly. "Yes," I said, "we are." That answer mattered more than anything else that had happened, because safety isn't just the absence of danger, it's the presence of peace, and peace had returned, but not without cost. There were moments of grief, moments where I mourned the son I thought I had, the future I imagined, the version of myself who believed love meant enduring everything. Letting go of that illusion hurt, but holding on to it would have destroyed me. I understood now that confronting the truth doesn't just expose others, it transforms you. And as I stood in my kitchen one evening, stirring a pot of soup, carefully tasting it, adding salt, I smiled quietly to myself. Not because of the soup, but because I finally understood what that night had given me. It wasn't pain.
It wasn't fear. It was clarity. The clarity doesn't arrive gently. It brings consequences with it. The official investigation didn't end with that meeting. In many ways, it had only just begun. Statements were taken again, this time formally. My recordings were reviewed by professionals who listened not with emotion, but with trained precision. They heard what I had lived with. They heard the pauses, the manipulation disguised as concern, the entitlement hidden beneath calm words. And once they heard it, they couldn't unhear it. Callum was summoned for questioning, not as a worried son, but as someone whose actions needed explaining. When he realized this, the panic finally surfaced. He called Laura from a number she didn't recognize, leaving voicemails that shifted wildly in tone, apologies layered with blame, promises mixed with threats. "Tell them you misunderstood. This is going to ruin me. You owe me." Laura played the messages for her solicitor. They became evidence. The man who once controlled every narrative had lost his grip on all of them. I wasn't present when Callum was interviewed, but I heard about it later, how defensive he became, how often he contradicted himself, how he tried to minimize everything while also justifying it. That contradiction mattered. People who tell the truth don't need to defend it so aggressively. As the days passed, the image he had carefully curated began to crack publicly. Family members who had once nodded along to his version of events started asking questions, uncomfortable ones. An aunt called me late one night. "I didn't believe it at first," she admitted, "but now I see it." Those words brought no satisfaction, only sadness, because belief shouldn't come this late. The legal consequences followed quietly but decisively. Callum was ordered to attend behavioral assessments. He was warned formally about continued contact. Any violation would escalate matters quickly. For the first time in his adult life, boundaries were being enforced against him, and he didn't know how to exist without crossing them. He tried once more. A letter arrived, handwritten, emotional, carefully worded. He wrote about stress, about pressure, about how much he loved me. He never once wrote the word sorry. I folded the letter and handed it to my solicitor. Love that doesn't take responsibility isn't love, it's possession. One afternoon, months after the appointment, I found myself standing in the same kitchen where everything had begun. Sunlight poured through the window, illuminating the table, the chairs, the floor where I once sat shaking. I realized something then. That kitchen no longer held fear, it held memory. And memory, unlike fear, doesn't control you, it teaches you. That realization marked the true turning point at the climax. Not the meeting, not the documents, not even Callum's exposure, but the moment I understood that he no longer had access to me. Not emotionally, not physically, not psychologically. I had reclaimed myself. The final confrontation came unexpectedly, not in a courtroom, not in an office, but in a quiet letter delivered through official channels. Callum requested mediation, one last attempt to regain ground. I considered it carefully. Then I declined.
That decision was harder than agreeing would have been, because saying no, cleanly, firmly, without explanation, meant accepting that the relationship I once imagined was truly over. But endings are sometimes the only way forward. When the rejection reached him, his reaction was immediate. He lashed out online, posting vague accusations, painting himself as the victim of betrayal. It didn't work. People asked questions. He deleted the posts. Silence followed. That silence wasn't peace for him. It was exposure, because when manipulative people are no longer believed, they're forced to face themselves, and that is something many never do. For me, the climax wasn't about watching him fall. It was about watching myself stand. Stand in rooms where I once felt small, speak without fear of being dismissed, make decisions without seeking permission. I began attending support groups not because I felt broken, but because I wanted to understand what had happened to me. Listening to others, I realized how common my story was. Different details, same patterns. That knowledge grounded me. It told me I wasn't unlucky. I had been targeted, and surviving that didn't make me weak. It made me informed. One evening, Laura and Amelia came over for dinner. We cooked together, slowly, laughing when something went wrong. Amelia insisted on tasting the soup. She frowned seriously, then nodded. "It's perfect," she said. I felt my throat tighten, because perfection wasn't the point. Choice was. Later, after they left, I sat alone at the table, running my fingers over the smooth wood. I thought about how close I had come to losing everything, my home, my voice, my identity, and I thought about how quietly it had almost happened. That, more than anything, stayed with me, because evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it wears the face of family, and the climax of this story, the real one, was not his downfall. It was my awakening.
The silence that followed everything was unfamiliar. Not the heavy silence I had lived with before, the kind that pressed against your chest and made you afraid to breathe. This silence was lighter. It had space in it. In the weeks after the confrontation, my life slowed down in a way it never had before. There were appointments, of course, paperwork, follow-up meetings, but none of it felt urgent in the way fear does. For the first time in a long while, I was making decisions without bracing myself for consequences. I rearranged the furniture in the living room, moving the chair I always avoided because it faced the doorway. I painted the spare room a soft, warm color and turned it into a space that felt welcoming rather than forgotten. Small things, but small things matter when you're learning how to live again. Laura and Amelia came by often, sometimes for dinner, sometimes just to sit quietly and drink tea. Laura looked different, still tired, but lighter, as if the constant tension in her shoulders had finally eased. One afternoon, she said something that stayed with me. "I didn't realize how much I was shrinking," she admitted. "I thought that was just adulthood." I nodded. "So did I said. Amelia began to change too. She laughed more freely, she slept through the night, she stopped flinching when voices were raised on television. Children notice everything, they just don't always have the words for it. Therapy helped her, it helped Laura, and eventually it helped me too, not because I felt broken, but because I wanted to understand how quietly control can settle into a home. I learned that abuse doesn't always arrive with bruises. Sometimes it arrives with rules, with concern, with "I know what's best for you." Understanding that changed the way I saw my past, not with shame, but with clarity. Callum faded into the background of my life. Not dramatically, not all at once. He became paperwork, occasional updates from solicitors, a name I no longer said out loud. There were moments of grief, I won't pretend there weren't. I mourned the son I thought I had raised. I mourned birthdays that would never be celebrated the way I once imagined. I mourned the idea that love alone could fix everything. Letting go of those dreams hurt, but holding on to them would have hurt more.
One evening, months later, I found myself cooking soup again. The same recipe, the same pot. I tasted it carefully, added salt, stirred slowly, then I stopped and laughed quietly to myself. Not because of the soup, but because I realized how much power that moment had once held over me and how little it held now. Food no longer felt like a test. Silence no longer felt like surrender. Love no longer meant endurance. I had redefined all of it. The house felt like mine again, not just legally, but emotionally. I slept deeply, I woke without dread, I walked through my days without rehearsing conversations in my head. Peace, I learned, isn't loud, it's steady, and steady was enough. One afternoon, Amelia asked me a question that caught me off guard. "Nana," she said, swinging her legs from the chair, "why didn't you tell anyone sooner?" I thought about that carefully before answering. "Because sometimes," I said, "we're taught to believe that keeping quiet keeps everyone safe." She frowned. "But it didn't," she said. "No," I replied gently, "it didn't." She nodded, satisfied, and went back to drawing. In that moment, I knew the cycle had been broken. Not perfectly, not forever, but enough. Enough for her to grow up knowing that fear is not love, that silence is not strength, that respect is non-negotiable. As for me, I no longer describe myself as quiet. I am thoughtful, I am observant, I am deliberate, and those things are not weaknesses. They are how I survived. They are how I reclaimed my life. And reclaiming it didn't mean becoming loud, angry, or hardened. It meant becoming honest. Honest about what I had endured, honest about what I would never tolerate again, honest about the fact that love without respect is not love at all. For a long time, I believed strength looked a certain way. I thought strong people fought back immediately. I thought strong people never doubted themselves. I thought strong people didn't stay as long as I did. I was wrong.
Real strength, I learned, often looks like patience, like watching, like waiting until you understand exactly what you're dealing with. It looks like surviving long enough to choose your moment. If you're listening to my story and wondering why I didn't leave sooner, why I stayed quiet, why I tried to make things work, please understand this. Control rarely arrives all at once. It creeps in slowly, disguised as concern, responsibility, even love. By the time you recognize it, your world has already shrunk around you. Leaving isn't always about walking out the door. Sometimes it's about waking up inside your own mind. I don't hate my son. That truth surprises people. What I feel is grief for the man he chose to become and for the mother I was forced to stop being. But I also feel something else now. Freedom. Freedom from fear. Freedom from self-doubt. Freedom from believing that my worth depended on how much I could endure. If there is one thing I want you to take from this, it's this. Silence does not mean consent. Patience does not mean weakness, and staying does not mean you deserve what happens to you. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop explaining someone else's behavior and start protecting yourself. I used to believe that keeping the peace was my responsibility. Now I know better. Peace that requires you to disappear is not peace at all. Today, my home is quiet, but not the kind of quiet that hurts. It's the quiet of safety, of choice, of knowing that no one gets to raise their hand at me ever again, physically or otherwise. And if you're hearing this and recognizing pieces of your own life in my words, I want you to remember this. You are not imagining it. You are not too sensitive, and you are not alone. There is a version of your life waiting on the other side of clarity.
It doesn't arrive overnight. It doesn't arrive easily, but it arrives the moment you decide that your dignity matters more than someone else's comfort. That night, years ago, my son thought he had broken me over a bowl of soup. What he actually did was wake me up, and that awakening saved my life. Not in the dramatic way stories often end. There were no celebrations, no sudden happiness, no moment where everything magically felt healed. What came instead was something quieter. Choice. The freedom to choose how my days looked, who had access to my time, what kind of love I allowed near me. For the first time, I wasn't surviving someone else's expectations. I was living by my own. I began rebuilding slowly, without pressure to be okay. Some mornings I woke up strong. Other mornings I sat with my tea and cried without knowing exactly why. Both were allowed. Healing, I learned, doesn't move in straight lines. It circles back. It pauses. It surprises you. But it also teaches you patience with yourself. People sometimes ask me if I regret anything, if I regret staying as long as I did, if I regret trusting my son, if I regret believing love could fix what respect never existed to support. I don't, because regret assumes I had the knowledge then that I have now. I didn't. I was doing the best I could with the truth I understood at the time, and when the truth changed, so did I. What I do regret is how many women still believe silence is their duty, how many parents believe endurance is proof of love, how many people are told to keep the family together at the cost of their own safety. Families don't fall apart when someone speaks the truth. They fall apart when abuse is protected by silence. Today, my life is simpler. There are fewer people in it, but the ones who remain see me clearly. They don't ask me to be smaller. They don't confuse control with care. They don't expect me to suffer quietly to keep them comfortable. That has changed everything. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the version of myself who lay on the kitchen floor, stunned, humiliated, wondering how her own child could hurt her. I wish I could reach back and speak to her. I would tell her this: "You're not weak for staying, you're not foolish for loving, and you're not broken for being hurt." I would tell her that one day she would stand in the same kitchen without fear, that her voice would return, that her life would belong to her again. And if you're listening to this and carrying your own quiet pain, I want you to know something too. You don't have to explode to be powerful. You don't have to scream to be heard, and you don't have to prove your suffering to deserve help. Awareness is a beginning. Boundaries are a choice, and dignity is something you earn. It's something you reclaim. That bowl of soup was never about salt. It was about power. And the moment I stopped apologizing for existing was the moment that power shifted. Not back to him, but to me.
Thank you for watching. Your trust, your time, and your support truly mean everything. If this video brought you value, please like, share, and subscribe. It helps this channel reach those who need it most. Stay focused, keep growing, and I'll see you in the next video.